Cynthia, for inviting me to do this. It's a really fun topic for me to talk about. And I feel like a little bit I'm talking to the choir here. I think this group understands ageism a little bit more than sort of a general medical population, but I'm still hoping you'll be surprised by some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. So don't overthink this. First few things that come to mind when someone says, hey, you're old.
I'm not.
I'm not, right? How dare you, right? Right? It's not, the first 10 things are not positive. Let's agree on that, right? So we'll talk about ageism. First, I'm going to talk about what ageism is, how we define that, so we're all on the same page. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what we know about ageism, how it impacts our health. And I think that stuff is really fascinating. Then think a little bit about, okay, so great. Now, what do we do about this? Is there any evidence that we can do anything about it? Is there a way we can come up with a personal plan for combating this? So again, known to this group very, very well that older adults are in our population and in our healthcare system are tremendously underappreciated and planning for things. So we know that in Katrina, who died mostly in Katrina? The poor old folks who were stuck in nursing homes because there was no plan for this. 20 years later, who died at the fastest rates when we had the pandemic in 2020? Old folks stuck in nursing homes because there still was no darn plan for this. We don't tend to plan to maximize the health of older adults, particularly frail and isolated older adults, particularly those that are in nursing home settings, but in other settings as well, the home care setting and so forth. So lest you forget, however, increasingly, it's going to be harder and harder for this to be hidden from us. We want to ignore that older adults exist in society. We want to say, if you're in a nursing home, we're not going to think about you and we're going to pretend you don't exist. But these numbers are growing and growing and growing. And so if you see here on the graph, by 2034, there's going to be more older adults than younger adults. Older adults going straight up, younger adults going straight down, and that crosses around 2034. So about 20% of the population is going to be over 65 just by 2030. So this is coming and coming very, very soon. Now, does anybody else besides me know who George Burns is? Please. See, this is my crowd. These are my people right here. I love you all. Because gave this talk in a couple different settings. Students have no idea who George Burns is. And they're like, who is that? You're old, Colleen. So George Burns, for those of you who don't know, was a comedian, a famous comedian. He always had his stogie in his hand. He lived to be 100 years old plus 6 weeks. And someone asked him, Mr. Burns, what's your secret to living to be 100? And he said, if you want to live to be 100, then you can't act like you're dying at 65. That is so prescient, right? Like, why do we do this to older adults? Why do we say on your 65th birthday, you suddenly are old, you suddenly lose your value, you suddenly should be acting old, acting your age and so forth. So we need to do differently. So that's the first thing. Second point is that ageism is prevalent and harmful. I think I got this picture from you, Danelle. I think this was in one of your talks that you shared with me. The world's most tattooed lady. That sounds totally like a Danelle thing, though, right? It may not have been, but I
don't think this would be, but maybe it's you. You took it from yourself and you got confused between us.
It's good makeup. So definitions of ageism. So here is a standardly accepted definition: discrimination against older people due to negative and inaccurate stereotypes. Due to negative and inaccurate stereotypes. So according to the World Health Organization, this is the most pervasive and socially acceptable form of discrimination. So when you talk to people and you talk about ageism, they're like, I don't even think there is ageism. I never really pick up on it. It's because it's in the fiber of everything you do. You are swimming in it so much. It's like that joke about the fish, and something swims by and says hey, how's the water? And the other fish says, what's the water? Right? It's just all around you. You don't even recognize it because it's so prevalent and so socially acceptable to make yucks about being old. In fact, industry wants us not to like aging, right? All of our advertising, when we do advertise targeting older adults, is all fear-based. You do not want to age. You do not want to have wrinkles, heaven forbid, your hair turns gray, and so on and so forth. So although older adults spend the most money on products and services, most of the advertising doesn't target them. When you're watching TV later today, look at the ads. You'll see young people playing tennis, and you'll see, unless it's something like for, erectile dysfunction or coloring your hair or something like that. But, most of the marketing budgets go towards younger adults. And when they do go towards older adults, it's only in a fear-based way. So anybody try and go buy moisturizer in the grocery store? Like, I have really dry skin. And so you go in the grocery store and you go down the aisle, and you cannot find one that isn't labeled anti-aging. It's really hard to find one that doesn't say anti-aging cream. And I'm like, I'm a geriatrician. I can't have this in my cupboard. Like, I can't have some medical student come by and look in my cupboard and see that I've got anti-aging cream. As I'm pro-aging, I am but I want to age in a moist way. I just want moisture. It's really, really hard to find something that. And so this stereotype tells all of us since the time we were kids that as you get older, you become invisible, that you become small, that you become weak, ugly, useless, burdensome, impotent, cognitively impaired, and feminized. And we all know in this society what that means. That's not. Those are the messages that ageism sends us all. Anybody have patients who say, I know you said I should go to this daycare thing, but those people there are all old, right? I don't feel the same as, I don't feel like I'm old. I like to hang out with younger people because I don't think I'm like, Mrs. Jones, you're 96. You have certainly earned the title of older, right? But our patients don't actually feel this way. Most of our patients don't feel this way about aging, even though these are the messages that we are sent. I love this quote from a marketing exec that says, if you took your entire view of the human race from primetime advertising alone, you'd see a society without old people. They don't work, they don't drink beer, they don't drive cars, they don't exist. And that's the message ageism is sending. Okay. So ageism is often thought of as having both these components, how you attitudes towards aging and how you feel against aging, how you behave against aging, and then these practices that perpetuate ageism. So not so pretty ageism. So the top is an ad for luggage, and it says, this old bag you'll actually love. How offensive is that, right? Yeah, there's from a birthday card. You've probably seen this. Again, I'm ashamed. When I find birthday cards, I buy them, I stick in my desk drawer at home. And once I was looking through that, I was like, oh my gosh, about half of these are ageist. Like, even I had bought them thinking they were funny at one point. And here's I wish I could credit this. I found this on the internet and I loved it. I could not find the source for it, but people talking about how they are impacted by ageism. One says, I was treated like I was senile. The next gentleman says, I was passed over for being near retirement. And the last one said they were berated and called a waste of time. Okay, so we know what ageism is. And we got it. We got the messages. Everybody's seen it. It's in the water. We all know about this. So what? Does this make a difference to us? Well, one of the papers that got me interested in reading more and learning and trying to come up with some educational interventions around ageism was this one that came out in June of 2022. This was published in JAMA Open, and it was a cross-sectional survey of 2,000 adults aged 50 to 80. They're all community dwelling. And it was part of the National Poll of Healthy Aging. It was from the University of Michigan. And so the population is 71% white. So take that as, when you think about external validity, that's something to consider. And what they did in this study, this cross-sectional study, was that they measured ageism. And they broke it down to 3 different categories, but they used this thing called the Everyday Ageism Scale. And they looked at whether experiencing more or less ageism related to health outcomes. And first of all, what they showed was that experiencing ageism is almost universal in this population. So the very top bar is experiencing any ageism, and it's like 88% or something like that. So nearly everybody says, oh yeah, I've experienced ageism. Then they break down the different categories. So ageist messages, and they have examples of that. Ageism and interpersonal interactions, examples of that, and internalized ageism, which, by the way, was the most prevalent form. What we think about ourselves as we age. We all harbor, 70% of us harbor these beliefs that as we get older, we should become invisible, we should become slower when we run, we should become, and so forth. So super prevalent, okay, and closely linked to health outcomes. So across the x-axis, you have the Everyday Ageism Scale, and the higher up means the more ageism you've experienced. The top box is fair or poor physical health. To the right is chronic health conditions, fair or poor mental health, and depressive symptoms. And what you see is that there's a pretty direct relationship. The more ageism you experience, the worse your health is related to these categories. Oops, I meant to take that. No, we're just going to skip right over that one. So this is another study, so related to bad health. This is another study by Becca Levy, who has done much of the work in this area. She's kind of the god of ageism in my book. And she did this study looking at using BLSA data, looking at people who had measures of, it was a different tool that they used to look at the experience of ageism and how much, if they hold ageist beliefs about themselves and how that relates to survival and health outcomes. And what they found in the study was that having more positive views of aging, having fewer ageist beliefs about yourself was associated with an increased survival of 7.5 years. 7.5 years. Like, if I can change your mind, does that mean you live 70? Give me a drug that can do that. That's pretty tough to do, right? 7.5 years is a big difference there. And they found that the people that had more positive views about what aging could hold for them were far more likely to participate in preventive health measures and screening and seeing their doctor and exercising, all those other things, because that makes sense, right? If you think the future could hold some positive things and you want to try and get to the future, you want to try and stay healthy as long as you can. So really important health implications here. This was a really recent study that just came out in April of 2023, again by Becca Levy and somebody Slate, I can't remember the first name, that was published in JAMA Open in April of this year. And what they looked at, so you might say, okay, well, they're older adults, sometimes people are interested in survival, but the thing they really fear is cognition, right? Losing their mind as they get older. They're afraid of dementia. So in this study, they looked at 1,716 people over the age of 65 who were included in the health and retirement study. And to get into the study, you had to have MCI diagnosed at baseline. And have a measure of age beliefs. Again, used a different scale than the previous 2 studies, but I won't get into that. And then they looked to see, well, some of the people in the study followed longitudinally, though they were diagnosed with MCI at baseline, some of them actually improved to normal cognition over time. Some stayed the same, some got worse. And they looked to see if whether having ageist beliefs related to your recovery from MCI. And they also did a really rigorous correction for other factors that may influence that. So what they found was that having more positive views about aging, you were 30% more likely to recover from MCI, and you did it on average 2 years faster. Pretty cool. And again, this is corrected for age, gender, self-reported race, marital status, smoking, ApoE4 status, depression, vascular disease, diabetes, poor sleep, social isolation, and physical inactivity. So ageism relates to a lot of health survival, recovery from MCI, so on and so forth. Okay, ageism is definitely bad for your health. Everyone's convinced? Good. I saw no studies that showed ageism was good for your health. Let's put it that way. And plenty that said it was bad. And just by the way, ageism is not only bad for older adults, there's really good evidence that we start adopting ageist beliefs at age 4. So kids as early as 4 years old learn that older people should be pointed at and laughed at and made fun of, and that, you know, are the butt of jokes. They should be out of sight and so forth. They adopt these very, very ageist beliefs quite early on. Any talk about any form of discrimination, of course, we need to acknowledge that there are certain populations who are even more impacted by this. And usually that's because of intersection with other forms of discrimination. So, you know, if you mix ageism with sexism, so older women tend to face more ageism and more damage from ageism than older men do. Black individuals facing ageism, again, already sort of the 2 hit there, that they're already being discriminated against. So important to acknowledge that I'm talking about one form of discrimination, but they all feed on each other and all result in worse outcomes. All right, let's do something different about it. So let's start with some myths. So all of us know that, you know, as you get older, you lose some function. I have been running my whole life, and I still am like, I'm running slower and slower every year that goes by. It's just happening. Okay, that's true. Some things are going to change with aging, right? But it doesn't mean that being older means you're frail and miserable. And in fact, we know that organ function peaks. Most of us are on the downhill side of organ function in this room. Michelle, when does bone density peak?
30.
30. Okay. I'm well beyond that, right? Like most organ function peaks quite young and then slowly goes down with age. So the number 65 is just kind of made up, right? But most people, that doesn't have much functional implication unless they're stressed in some sort of way. These declines, however, are really exaggerated in our culture. Particularly with in light of what we know is a compression of morbidity in more recent decades. So we know that older adults are actually living longer and are healthier for a longer duration of time until closer to death when they get quite sick, whereas the reverse is actually true for teenagers. Teenagers are sicker much earlier. So though we talk about old adults as being sick and frail and a drain on our healthcare system and the gray tsunami and all those terrible, miserable things we say about older people, actually, there's not as much truth to it. And then, happiness is actually a U-shaped curve. So when you're in 2nd grade and you're going to school and you got your pals, and the only thing that you have to worry about is like what color your lunchbox is, and you know that's a pretty happy time of life. You've never heard of a bill. That's not so bad. And then it turns out like later things get a little bit tougher, right? So maybe you're going through med school or residency or fellowship training, and you're still trying to prove yourself, and you're working and you're still not making that much money, and there's like a lot. That's when happiness actually dips. And then it starts to go back up again with aging. And so the idea of like a curmudgeonly older person, actually that stereotype is inaccurate. More older people are happier than younger people. All right, and then cognitive and functional decline are way more potently determined by race, ethnicity, and educational attainment than by your genes or your age. And yes, I did say genes. It's a really small part. Okay. So now for some good news. Actually, we can change some of this stuff. We can do better about the bad impacts of ageism on our patients and on our moms and on our families and on ourselves. So if she can do that, surely we could change our language a little bit, right? This picture is from a book called Growing Old is Not for Sissies. It's a photo book of master athletes. It's really amazing. I'm looking over at Max. Matt, I think you'd really like the book. All right. So let's remember that there are gifts of getting older. So I talked about, okay, when you're young and you're in second grade and all you care about, well, the downside of being in second grade is that your parents are like, you're going to sit at the dinner table till you eat all of that broccoli, right? You don't quite have all the autonomy that you wish you could have. There are pros and cons to every stage in life, and that is still true as you get older. There are some deaths of family members that are more prevalent. There's, like I talked about, slowing of running, maybe creaky joints, so on and so forth, that are common as you get older. But also, these things get better as you get older. So your perspective, your wisdom, your judgment, your experience, you've amassed 80, 90 years worth of experience to bring to solving problems. That's going to make you a really good problem solver. Your social values get more solidified and clarified as you get older. Your ability to regulate your emotions. Oh, heavens, remember back when you were a teenager? Any of you have teenagers in the room? Yeah, right? Like, oh, God, thank goodness that gets better as you get older. And it continues to get better as you age. It doesn't stop at 65. Your ability to synthesize things, your ability to practice metacognition, your creativity continues. This is why we often see artists and so forth who continue producing very, long until old age, until near death. Your ability to solve problems and just becoming your authentic self, just feeling comfortable with who you are. There was a really lovely photo essay thing that Cynthia sent me from the New York Times recently. I think it was like 13 artists, photographers who took pictures and told stories. And one of them was talking about like how when he was younger, he threw away at least half of the negatives of the photos that he took because he was afraid people are going to see him and he'd be embarrassed and they were crap and blah, blah, blah. But now, he doesn't care what anybody thinks. He can just take pictures and enjoy doing that. And he's taking them for himself because he's confident in what he does and doesn't, becoming your authentic self is a pretty lovely goal for all of us. That's something we should all be kind of celebrating about aging, right? All right. So when we think about what we know about ageism and we think about what we know about fixing ageism, how do you want to age? How do you want to interact with your doctor? How do you want to treat patients and your family and so forth? Let me just give this one more time. So the good news is that at least in a couple small studies, and there's not as much data here. This again was from Becca Levy in a trial. What they did was they took individuals and brought them into the lab and said, can we change this effect of ageism? And so what they did was they took these individuals, brought them in, and for 4 weeks exposed them to subliminal messages about ageism. So pictures that had words and so on and so forth. And some of them said things like, wise, wisdom, valued, matriarch, those kind of things. And then other ones were neutral about that. And then they studied their function over time after those 4 weeks. And what they saw in the light bars are people who were exposed to the positive age belief activation intervention. So these subliminal messages that saying, hey, there's some great things about aging. And the neutral condition is in the dark bars. And you see that at week 5, 6, and 8, which is as long as the trial was. Strength, function, all the functional outcome measures improved dramatically just by telling people they could do better. There's another study I saw where they videotaped individuals seeing their primary care doctor. This wasn't an intervention, but they analyzed the words. And if they were exposed to a primary care doctor who used words that connoted negative things about aging, when walking in the office, walking out of the office, comparing that, the gait speed was much slower after that visit versus those who used positive images, the gait speed was faster. So there's a little bit of data that says the language actually could make kind of a huge difference in how people feel. Again, surely those genetic factors, genes. I don't believe in it. So we all worry about ApoE4 and the risk of dementia and so forth. And what they've shown in this study was that the dementia incidence is on the y-axis, and they have positive, negative age beliefs. So those with ApoE4, if you have positive age beliefs, you have the same rate of dementia as someone who does not even have ApoE4. This is important. This makes a big difference. Okay. Oh, and a little reminder from Linda Fried and so many of the researchers here who have worked on experience core, that all of us need a reason to get up each day. And that also doesn't expire at your 65th birthday. Everyone needs a reason to feel they belong, they're important, they're contributing. So experience core, as many of you in this room know, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, was a really wonderful study looking at taking failing any inner city Baltimore schools where students had very high truancy rates, very low graduation rates, doing very, very poorly on standardized tests, and taking retirees who volunteered to go in the school and work with those kids. And what they found was that it worked great. The kids had much reduced truancy rates, started graduating, doing far, far better. And by the way, the volunteers became healthier. They used less medications. They were physically more fit. They had improved physical function and improved cognitive function in doing so. So keeping engaged is really important too. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, we are what we repeatedly do. So excellence is not an act, but a habit. So let's try and think about our habits around this topic. And there's a lot of different ways you can combat ageism. I tend to think about educational interventions. How can we take this information and spread it to crowds and get people thinking and talking? But certainly we can enact change through policy and law and using intergenerational interventions like the experience core. So here are some of the things that people in this room can do now. So first of all, check your stories. So I tell myself these bad stories all the time. You probably do too. Again, internalized ageism is really, really common. So when we first started with EPIC, I would always say, I'm just so bad at computers. It must be I'm just getting too old for computers. Well, that's just ridiculous. Anybody who can memorize all the cranial nerves, and so I can learn how to use computer. Like, it's just a stupid story to tell yourself. Check your stories about what you tell yourself about aging and what you tell your patients about aging too. Think about the images we use in presentations. Remember that one study? That was all images and some words flashed up subliminally. But pretty commonly when we see a talk about geriatrics, whatever the subject matter is, the picture is like a little old lady in a chair, kind of slumped over, looking wistfully out the window. Maybe it's raining on the pane. I don't know. It's not a real joyful picture is the point. So trying to use more positive aging related images in our presentations when we teach. Use your power. And so that means how you spend your money and how you vote to try and counter these messages. Thinking about messages in social media, the birthday cards that you buy and so forth. Trying to put an end to this young, old, there's no such thing as like, now you're young and now you're old. It's a continuous variable. That doesn't even make sense. So we can stop doing that. Stop blaming older adults for things and instead look at the root cause. It's not because they're too old and that's why our healthcare system is too expensive and so forth. It's because we haven't figured out how to care for them best, because we don't have the right services, because it's not that they're older. We should celebrate that people are living longer. And making sure that our teams include older adults whenever possible. So I'm going to skip this one too for the sake of time. So here's just like how this might look in the office. So this is an example just from my own clinic a little while back of things that I heard and ways that I thought to respond. And you probably have ideas about things you can do too. So someone saying, my knees hurt because I'm old. And that, people say, oh, it's my back aches because I'm old. This is happening because I'm old. He said, both your knees are the same age, but this one has arthritis. And we know how to treat arthritis. Let me tell you about that. Let's talk about how we can fix that, improve that. Another patient, when I went to examine her hand, she said, oh my God, my hands are just so ugly. And I said, my Aunt Amy was the hardest working person I knew. She waited tables until she died of lung cancer at 75 years old. I always loved her hands. They showed the story of a hardworking, determined, independent woman. Your hands remind me of that, and tell your story too. Well, that feels a little different, right? I can't learn computers, the one I just mentioned. So learning things does take more effort as we get older, but you absolutely can continue to learn to do anything you set your mind to. Stop telling yourself stories that aren't true. My brain doesn't work anymore because I'm older. There's no line, because I'm old, there's no line between old and young, but your brain and body do change throughout your entire life. What specifically are you having challenges with? Let's look at that and try and understand. And then one of my real pet peeves, I know it's said like meant well, but she's just such an adorable little old lady. She's so cute, all this infantilizing language. So I try to gently respond, I try to avoid infantilizing people who have lived so long and deserve our respect. So those are some examples of ways you might think about acting anti-ageist. A few good resources listed here. Ashton Applewhite is a reporter who talks about this all the time. She has a book out. She's also got a TED Talk that's wonderful. Becca Levy has this book out and loads of research that I referenced in my talk. Louise Aronson's book is wonderful. Atul Gawande's book is wonderful too. And I'll end there. If you know all 5 of these individuals and their ages, I'd be very impressed.
Okay, we have time for a comment or question or two.
Jeremy and Danelle.
Oh, no,
Sorry.
someone